My wife secretly drained my entire retirement fund, then laughed in my face. But she had no idea the bank manager was standing at our door with documents that would expose everything. One knock changed our marriage forever, and her smile disappeared the moment she read the truth. For 38 years, I believed I knew the woman I had married. Margaret and I had built a life that looked ordinary from the outside. We raised 2 children, paid off our mortgage, celebrated birthdays in the same backyard every summer, and dreamed about retirement during every family dinner. "I'm counting the days," Margaret would often say with a smile. "Just imagine, no alarm clocks. Just you, me, and the lake house." I believed every word. At 65, I finally retired after 4 decades as an electrical engineer. The farewell party at work was everything I could have hoped for. My coworkers handed me a framed photograph of the team, my boss gave a heartfelt speech, and everyone applauded as I walked out of the office for the last time. For the first time in years, I felt free. My retirement savings represented decades of sacrifice. I had skipped expensive vacations. I drove the same pickup truck for 15 years. I worked overtime instead of taking holidays. Every dollar had a purpose. Our financial advisor often praised my discipline. "You've done everything right, David," he once told me. "You and Margaret should have a comfortable retirement." Those words stayed with me. Or so I thought. 3 weeks after retiring, I decided to review our finances. Not because I was worried. Just because old habits die hard. Margaret was shopping with her sister that afternoon, leaving me alone in the house. I logged into our retirement account. The loading circle spun for several seconds. Then the balance appeared. I blinked. Surely I had read it wrong. I refreshed the page. Same number. I checked again. Then again. Nearly every dollar was gone. Over $760,000 had disappeared. My hands started shaking. "No." I whispered the word to an empty room. There had to be a mistake. Maybe the website had crashed. Maybe it was showing another account. I called customer service immediately. After answering security questions, the representative spoke calmly. "Mr. Harrison, according to our records, these withdrawals were authorized over the past 11 months. "Authorized?" "Yes, sir. I never authorized anything." There was a brief silence. "Our records show the transactions were completed with joint account approval." Joint account. That meant Margaret. The room suddenly felt smaller. She came home an hour later carrying shopping bags. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "Guess what? I found those garden chairs you've been wanting." I stared at her. She noticed immediately. "What?" I slowly turned my laptop toward her. "What happened to our retirement account?" She froze. Only for a second. Then she smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an apologetic smile. Almost confident. "Oh." Just one word. "Oh." I stood. "Where's the money?" She calmly placed her purse on the table. "I spent it." I couldn't believe what I'd heard. "You, what?" "I spent it." The words came so casually it felt unreal. $760,000. She shrugged. "It wasn't all at once." I felt like the floor had vanished beneath me. "You emptied our retirement." "Our retirement?" She laughed softly. "David, you act like you've never spent money before. This wasn't grocery money. It was ours. Our future." She crossed her arms. "I wanted to enjoy life while we're still healthy." My heart pounded. "Enjoy life?" She nodded. "I invested." "In what?" She hesitated, then smiled again. "Different opportunities." "What opportunities?" "You wouldn't understand." That answer only made everything worse. Over the next hour I learned pieces of the truth. She had invested with someone she met through a luxury travel group online. A man who promised incredible returns. He convinced her they could double their retirement within a year. She never asked me, never mentioned it. She simply transferred money again, and again, and again, each time believing the next investment would recover previous losses. Classic fraud. But she refused to admit it. "He said the funds are temporarily frozen." I stared at her. "Margaret, he promised everything would be released." "You're describing a scam." "It isn't." "It is." She slammed her hand on the kitchen counter. "You don't know everything." Silence filled the room. After almost 40 years together, I realized I didn't know the woman standing in front of me. That night I couldn't sleep. She slept peacefully beside me, as if nothing had happened. I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every sacrifice replayed in my mind. Every overtime shift. Every missed vacation. Every Christmas when I bought cheaper gifts because we were saving for retirement. Gone. Because my wife trusted a stranger more than me. The next morning I called our bank. The manager requested an urgent meeting. His voice sounded unusually serious. Mr. Harrison, I'd prefer discussing this in person. My stomach tightened. There was more, much more. At the bank, the manager closed his office door. He placed several documents on his desk. I wish we'd met sooner. What does that mean? He looked uncomfortable. Over the past year, your wife didn't just transfer retirement funds. My heart sank. What else? He slid another document toward me. Home equity loan. I stared at the paper. No, I'm afraid your house was also used as collateral. I couldn't breathe. Our house. Yes. Without telling me, the signatures appeared valid. I looked closely. Someone had signed my name. Perfectly. Almost. But not quite. It wasn't mine. I slowly raised my eyes. That's a forgery. The manager nodded. We've already contacted our fraud department. Everything became silent. The room, the air, even my thoughts. Someone had forged my signature. Either Margaret, or someone working with her. I drove home in complete silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every memory inside that house suddenly felt different. Every photograph, every anniversary, every promise. Had any of it been real? As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Margaret sitting on the porch drinking iced tea. She smiled. The same calm smile. She had no idea what I had just learned. I stepped out of the truck. She looked up. How'd the bank meeting go? I stared at her for several long seconds. Then quietly asked one question. Margaret, did you forge my signature? Her smile disappeared. David watched Margaret's face lose all color. For the first time since the truth about the missing retirement savings had come out, she looked genuinely afraid. What are you talking about? She asked, forcing a weak smile. David didn't answer immediately. He slowly pulled the folded documents from his jacket pocket and laid them on the patio table. The bank showed me these. Margaret glanced down. The moment she saw the signature page, her hand trembled. You told them I signed these papers, David said quietly. I didn't. She swallowed hard. I can explain. Then explain. Tears welled in her eyes, but David no longer knew whether they were real or another performance. I never wanted this to happen. Did you forge my signature? She closed her eyes. Yes. The single word hit David harder than any shout ever could. For 38 years, he had trusted this woman with every paycheck, every family decision, every dream. Now she had admitted to a felony without even raising her voice. I thought I could fix everything before you found out, she whispered. Fix what? The investments started losing money. So you borrowed against our home. I thought if I invested more, I'd recover everything. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. You risked our retirement, then our house, because you were trying to recover money that was already gone. Margaret nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I was scared. David laughed bitterly. No, Margaret. She looked up. You weren't scared. You were arrogant enough to believe you didn't need me. Silence settled between them. Just then, a black sedan slowly pulled into the driveway. Two people stepped out. One was the bank manager. The other wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase. Margaret frowned. Who are they? David didn't answer. The bank manager approached with a serious expression. Mrs. Harrison. The man beside him introduced himself. My name is Richard Collins. I'm with the bank's fraud investigations department. Margaret's face turned pale. Richard opened his briefcase. Mrs. Harrison, we need to ask you several questions regarding multiple financial transactions, forged loan documents, and transfers totaling more than $900,000. Margaret's coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the porch. David simply stood there. For the first time in 2 days. She wasn't smiling anymore. Richard Collins waited until everyone was seated in the living room before opening the thick file in front of him. The bank manager sat quietly beside him. David remained standing near the fireplace, unable to bring himself to sit. Margaret looked as though she wanted to disappear. Richard spoke first. Mrs. Harrison, this is not a criminal interview at this stage. Our goal is to understand exactly what happened. Margaret nodded weakly. I'll cooperate. Richard placed several bank statements on the coffee table. Over the past 11 months, there were 23 wire transfers from your retirement account, 4 transfers from your savings account, and a home equity loan secured against your property. David stared at the papers. He had spent decades building financial security. In less than a year, it had been dismantled. Richard continued. We traced many of the transfers to overseas accounts commonly associated with investment fraud. Margaret covered her face with both hands. I didn't know. You believed you were investing? Yes. Richard nodded. Unfortunately, these scams often convince victims to send more money after initial losses, promising that one final payment will unlock their profits. David looked at Margaret. So every time they asked for more money, she whispered, I thought it would save everything. Richard sighed. That's exactly how these operations work. The room fell silent. David felt anger, sadness, and exhaustion all at once. He no longer saw only betrayal. He saw fear, poor decisions, and manipulation. But one question still haunted him. Who forged my signature? Margaret slowly looked up. I did. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I watched you sign birthday cards for years. David closed his eyes. I practiced. Those two words hurt more than the confession itself. Richard closed one folder and opened another. There's one more issue. David frowned. What now? We've frozen the home equity loan after identifying the forged signature. Margaret looked up hopefully. So, we won't lose the house. Richard shook his head. Not immediately. David felt a small sense of relief. But, Richard paused. There's another problem. He slid a photograph across the table. David picked it up. It showed a smiling man in his early 50s. Expensive suit, luxury watch, perfect smile. Margaret gasped. That's him, the investor. She nodded. Richard folded his hands. His real name isn't Daniel Brooks. What? He's used at least 14 identities in 6 different countries. David stared at the picture. So he's a professional scammer. Richard nodded. And one of the most difficult to catch. Margaret began crying. I ruined everything. David didn't answer. For the first time, he believed she finally understood the damage. The following morning, David walked alone through the backyard. Every tree reminded him of a different year. He had planted the maple when their daughter was born. The apple tree after their son's graduation. The small wooden swing still hung beneath the old oak. Their grandchildren loved it. Would they still come here if the house was gone? He didn't know. His phone rang. It was his daughter, Emily. Dad, he tried to sound normal. Morning. You don't sound okay. He hesitated. Can you come over? An hour later, Emily and her younger brother Michael arrived. Margaret was sitting quietly at the kitchen table. Neither child had ever seen their mother look so defeated. David told them everything. Every transfer. Every lie. Every forged document. When he finished, no one spoke. Finally, Michael looked at his mother. Why didn't you tell Dad? Margaret couldn't answer. Emily quietly wiped away tears. You always taught us that marriage means honesty. Margaret nodded. I know. So why? I thought I could fix my mistake. Emily gently replied. You made another mistake every time you kept the secret. Margaret broke down crying. David looked away. Even now, he couldn't decide whether to comfort her or walk away forever. 3 days later, Richard Collins called again. I have news. David immediately sat upright. Did they catch him? Not yet. But, we located part of the money. David's heart raced. How much? Approximately $140,000. David closed his eyes. It wasn't everything. Not even close. But it was something. Richard continued. International authorities froze one account connected to the fraud network. Margaret burst into tears of relief. David remained cautious. Can we recover it? We believe so. For certain. Nothing is certain. Still, for the first time since discovering the missing retirement savings, hope returned. Very slowly. Very carefully. There was still a long road ahead. But maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't lost after all. 3 months passed. The house felt quieter than it ever had. Margaret no longer spent hours online. She canceled every luxury subscription, sold her designer jewelry, and even listed the sports car she had secretly purchased with part of the stolen money. Every dollar she recovered went toward paying down the debt. David noticed the effort, but rebuilding trust was far harder than rebuilding a bank account. Some wounds didn't heal with money. Every morning, he sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, wondering whether 40 years of marriage could survive 1 year of lies. One afternoon, Richard Collins called again. David, we have some good news. David immediately stood up. What happened? The international investigation has made significant progress. He held his breath. The man your wife knew as Daniel Brooks has been arrested overseas along with several members of his fraud network. David closed his eyes. So it's over. Not completely. But, we've recovered additional assets connected to the scam. David's heartbeat quickened. How much? After legal proceedings, we estimate you'll recover approximately $560,000. David couldn't speak. It wasn't the full amount. But it was enough to save their retirement. Enough to save their home. Enough to start over. Weeks later, David and Margaret attended court to finalize the fraud claims in the forged loan case. Because Margaret admitted everything from the beginning and fully cooperated with investigators, prosecutors focused their criminal case on the international fraud organization. The forged home equity loan was declared invalid. The bank officially removed the debt from their property. When they stepped outside the courthouse, Margaret quietly said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." David looked ahead. "I've thought about that every day." She waited. "I can forgive you." Tears filled her eyes. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." She nodded. "I know. And trust." He paused. "Trust has to be earned one day at a time." For the first time in months, Margaret didn't try to defend herself. She simply said, "I'll spend the rest of my life earning it." A year later, their family gathered in the same backyard where so many memories had been made. Emily's children laughed on the swing beneath the old oak tree. Michael grilled burgers while everyone talked and smiled. The atmosphere wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Margaret carried a small wooden box to David. "I have something for you." He opened it. Inside were all of his retirement journals. Every notebook where he had carefully planned their future. On top was a handwritten letter. He unfolded it. "David, for years, I believed I could fix every mistake by myself. Instead, I nearly destroyed everything we spent a lifetime building. Money can sometimes be recovered. Trust cannot be bought back. Thank you for giving me the chance to earn it again, even when I didn't deserve it. I promise there will never again be a secret between us. I love you, Margaret." David folded the letter carefully. He looked at the woman he had loved for nearly 4 decades. She wasn't the same person who had smiled when he first confronted her. Life had humbled her. Pain had changed her. He reached for her hand. She looked surprised. "I still have scars," he said. "I know, so do you." She nodded. "But maybe," David continued, "scars remind us what we survived." Margaret smiled. This time, it wasn't a smile of pride or denial. It was a smile of gratitude. A quiet, honest smile. The kind David hadn't seen in a very long time. As the sun began to set, their grandchildren ran across the yard, laughing without a care in the world. David watched them and realized something. His greatest retirement investment had never been the money in the bank. It had always been his family. Money could disappear, houses could be rebuilt, even trust, though painfully, could sometimes be restored. But the love of those willing to fight for one another was the only wealth that truly lasted. He slipped Margaret's letter back into the wooden box and closed the lid. This time, there would be no more secrets. Only truth, only honesty, and, at long last, a new beginning. Nearly 2 years passed. Life slowly found its rhythm again. David and Margaret attended financial counseling together, met with their advisor every month, and rebuilt their retirement plan one careful step at a time. They were never as wealthy as they had once expected to be, but they had something far more valuable: honesty. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, another unexpected knock echoed through the house. David opened the door. Standing outside was a middle-aged woman in a navy business suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Mr. David Harrison?" "Yes, my name is Laura Bennett. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Mr. Charles Harrison." David froze. His father's name. "My father passed away 15 years ago." "I know," Laura replied gently. "A sealed document has only recently been released." Margaret stepped into the hallway. "What document?" Laura held up a thick envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "Your father's final letter, and an amendment to his will." David stared at it in disbelief. "My father already had a will. Not this one." They invited Laura inside. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Laura smiled. "Your father instructed that only you should read this aloud." David unfolded the pages with trembling hands. "If you're reading this, it means you've faced the greatest financial challenge of your life." David stopped. His eyes widened. How could he know? Laura answered quietly. He didn't know the details. He only believed life would test your character. David continued reading. "Money has a strange way of revealing who people truly are. One day, you may lose everything you've worked for. If that happens, remember that your character is worth more than your bank account." Margaret lowered her eyes. The words struck her deeply. David reached the final page. There was another surprise. "There's one more gift I kept hidden until now." Laura slid another document across the table. It was the deed to a piece of land. "What is this?" Laura smiled. Your father quietly purchased 120 acres nearly 30 years ago. David looked confused. I've never heard of it. He wanted no one to know until the right time. Margaret whispered, he left it to you. Laura nodded. The land has never been sold. David looked at the appraisal attached to the deed. His hands began to shake. Current estimated value, $2.8 million. Neither David nor Margaret spoke. Laura smiled gently. Your father believed that true wealth should only come to someone after they had learned not to worship money. David quietly folded the letter. He looked at Margaret. Tears streamed down her face. 2 years earlier, losing money had nearly destroyed their marriage. Now they had been given another chance, not just financially, but emotionally. David took Margaret's hand. This time, he said softly, we make every decision together. Margaret nodded. Together. And for the first time in many years, the future no longer felt uncertain. The discovery of Charles Harrison's hidden land quickly became the biggest surprise of David and Margaret's lives. Neither of them told anyone outside the family. Not yet. David wanted time to think. For nearly a week, he drove to the property every morning. It sat on the edge of a quiet valley, covered with towering oak trees, a small creek, and open fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It wasn't just land, it was a legacy. As David stood there one afternoon, his phone rang. It was Laura Bennett. David, there's something you should know. What is it? Someone has already heard about the inheritance. David frowned. How? I'm not sure, but this morning my office received 3 calls from property developers asking if the land was for sale. I haven't listed it, I know. They're offering cash. David thanked her and hung up. Something didn't feel right. 2 days later, a black luxury SUV stopped outside David's home. A sharply dressed man stepped out, carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He introduced himself with a confident smile. My name is Victor Reynolds. David folded his arms. What can I do for you? I represent Horizon Development Group. Victor opened his briefcase and placed a contract on the kitchen table. We'd like to purchase your property. David glanced at the first page. Offer price, $4 million. Margaret gasped. It was far above the appraised value. David looked at Victor. Why so much? Victor smiled. Let's just say, we see potential. David had spent 40 years negotiating engineering contracts. He recognized that smile. It wasn't excitement, it was confidence. The kind someone has when they know something you don't. That evening, David drove back to the land. This time he walked farther than before. Near the creek, he noticed several wooden survey stakes marked with bright orange ribbons. He frowned. I didn't put these here. As he looked around, he saw fresh tire tracks leading into the woods. Someone had been on his property. Without permission, David immediately called Laura. The next morning, she arranged for an independent land survey. 3 days later, the surveyor returned with surprising news. Mr. Harrison, yes, you should probably sit down. David's stomach tightened. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. The surveyor smiled. In fact, this land is worth much more than anyone realized. He unfolded a geological report. Last month, the state confirmed the area contains one of the largest lithium deposits discovered in years. David stared at him. Lithium, the mineral used in electric vehicle batteries. David suddenly understood why Horizon Development had offered $4 million without negotiating. The surveyor continued, if mining rights are approved. He paused. This property could eventually be worth tens of millions of dollars. David was speechless. That night, Victor Reynolds returned. So, Mr. Harrison, he smiled confidently. Have you decided? David looked at the unsigned contract. Then he slowly slid it back across the table. No. Victor's smile faded. You may regret that, David calmly replied. I've already learned what happens when I make financial decisions without knowing the whole truth. Victor stood silently. David continued. This time, I'll wait. Victor picked up his briefcase and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back. This isn't over. David watched him drive away. Something told him the inheritance his father had left behind was about to change far more than his retirement. It was about to test his family all over again. Victor Reynolds' warning lingered in David's mind. This isn't over. For the next 2 weeks, strange things began happening. Unknown vehicles drove slowly past the Harrison house. David received repeated calls from private numbers, but no one spoke when he answered. One morning, he found a handwritten note tucked under his windshield wiper. Sell the land, before it becomes a problem. He folded the note and quietly placed it in his pocket. He didn't tell Margaret. Not yet. Laura Bennett urged David to install security cameras around both the house and the inherited property. 3 nights later, one of the cameras captured something unexpected. At 2:17 a.m., a pickup truck entered the property through an old dirt road. 2 men got out carrying metal detectors and shovels. They weren't there to admire the scenery. They were searching for something. The sheriff's deputies arrived before the men could leave. When questioned, they claimed they had entered the wrong property. The explanation didn't convince anyone. The next morning, David received another visitor. This one wasn't from a development company. He was an elderly man with silver hair, a walking cane, and a faded leather folder tucked under his arm. "My name is Thomas Walker," he said quietly. "I knew your father." David invited him inside. Thomas looked around the living room before speaking. "Charles Harrison once saved my family's farm." David smiled faintly. "That sounds like my father." Thomas nodded. He never asked for anything in return. He opened the old folder. Inside was a black and white photograph of 2 young men standing on the very same land David had inherited. One of them was Charles. The other was Thomas. "There was something buried on that property many years ago," Thomas said. David frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas leaned closer. "Not treasure. A promise." He explained that, decades earlier, Charles and a small group of local families had created a handwritten agreement protecting part of the valley from commercial development. Charles believed some places should remain untouched, no matter how much money was offered. Thomas handed David a weathered envelope. "Your father told me that if anyone ever tried to pressure you into selling, I should give you this." David carefully opened it. Inside was another handwritten letter. "David, if you're reading this, someone has discovered the true value of the land. Before you sell it to anyone, ask yourself one question: will this decision make your grandchildren proud 50 years from now?" David sat in silence. The words carried more weight than any offer of millions. That evening, Margaret read the letter too. She looked at David and quietly said, "2 years ago, I chased money and almost destroyed our family." She placed the letter back into its envelope. "I'm not making that mistake again." David nodded. "Neither am I." The next morning, he called Victor Reynolds. Victor answered on the first ring. "Have you come to your senses?" David replied calmly, "I've made my decision, and the land isn't for sale." There was a long silence. Then Victor spoke in a cold voice. "You just made a very expensive mistake." The line went dead. David looked out the window toward the sunrise. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of losing money. He was determined to protect something far more valuable. But he had no idea that Victor Reynolds wasn't acting alone, and the real battle for the Harrison land was only just beginning. The morning after David rejected the offer, Laura Bennett called with urgency in her voice. "David, don't sign anything from anyone." "I already refused." "Good, because Horizon Development isn't the real buyer." David frowned. "Then who is?" "There's another company hiding behind them. They've been using shell corporations to quietly buy land across the entire valley." Within a week, a town council meeting was announced. Residents packed the old community hall. Representatives from Horizon Development presented glossy drawings of a massive industrial project. Thousands of jobs, one executive promised. Economic growth, new roads, a brighter future. Many people applauded. Then David stood. "I have a question." The room fell silent. "How much of the valley will disappear if this project is approved?" The executive hesitated. "Some protected land." "How much?" He finally admitted. "Nearly 70%. Murmurs spread through the crowd. David reached into his briefcase and removed his father's handwritten letter. He didn't read all of it. Just one sentence. "Will this decision make your grandchildren proud 50 years from now?" The room became quiet. Even those who wanted the money lowered their eyes. A month later, the state completed its environmental review. The lithium deposit was confirmed, but so was something even more important. The valley contained one of the region's largest underground freshwater reserves. Large-scale mining could permanently damage it. The permit was denied. Without mining rights, Horizon Development withdrew its offer and abandoned the project. Victor Reynolds disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. No one ever heard from him again. Months passed. Instead of selling the land, David made a different decision. Working with the town, local farmers, and a conservation trust, he placed most of the property under permanent protection. A small section was leased for sustainable farming, creating steady income without destroying the valley. The rest became a public nature preserve. Children hiked the trails. Families picnicked by the creek. A wooden sign at the entrance read, "Harrison Family Preserve, protecting today what tomorrow will need." Margaret stood beside David as the ribbon was cut. She squeezed his hand. "You know," she whispered, "I used to think wealth was measured by the numbers in a bank account." David smiled. "And now," she looked around at the families enjoying the land, "now I know it's measured by what you leave behind." That evening, the entire Harrison family gathered beneath the old oak tree. Emily's children chased butterflies across the field. Michael grilled dinner while everyone laughed together. David looked at Margaret. They had survived betrayal, financial ruin, fraud, temptation, and the lure of easy money. Each challenge had taught the same lesson. Money can disappear overnight. Character cannot. As the sun dipped below the hills, David slipped his father's final letter back into its envelope. He smiled. His retirement hadn't turned out the way he had planned. It had turned out better. Because the greatest inheritance he received wasn't the land. It was the wisdom to know what was truly worth protecting.